Namaste and greetings, and welcome to the Center for Spiritually Integrated Arts, a Centers for Spiritual Living teaching center. I'm Reverend Dr. Raymond Anderson, the founding minister and spiritual director. If you ever have questions about who I am, who we are, what we do, what is Spiritually Integrated Arts? What is a teaching center? What is Centers for Spiritual Living? What is metaphysical spirituality? What is New Thought? Science of Mind and Spirit? How do I become a member? How can I support, tithe, and donate? All of these questions and so many more. Send an email. You have two options. SIAADMIN, Spiritually Integrated Arts, admin at spirituallyintegratederarts.org, or spirituallyintegratederarts@gmail.com. Either of those will work. You can also visit our website, www.spirituallyintegratederarts.org. Now, you may be wondering, where else can I find and follow? There are several other social media platforms that you can also subscribe and follow. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our YouTube channel, where you can also find all of our Sunday messages and more. I look forward to hearing from you soon. I look forward to you being a part of this beloved community. Because we are a virtual community, it doesn't matter where in the world you are. This can also be your spiritual community, because you can have more than one. Anywhere that you feel supported, anywhere you are spiritually fed is home, is community, is relationship. So I look forward to dialoguing more, conversing more, getting to know you. Much love and appreciation. Live long and prosper. Chat with you soon. Take care. Hello and welcome to the Center for Spiritually Integrated Arts. It is July. That means 3 Sundays this month, the 2nd, the 9th, and the 16th. We will gather in our Zoom fellowship hall. If you don't already have the link, send an email to either of those email addresses that you see on your screen and request the link to join this after message fellowship gathering, where we have lively conversation. We make plans to go to New York and see something on Broadway and have a metaphysical discussion over dinner and all kinds of things. Also, keep track of those two email addresses. You'll find out why in a moment. Keep track of the dates. The 2nd, the 9th, and the 16th will be our July gathering dates. Now, if you missed the pre-message that, before all of this, there's that whole 5-minute promo. If you haven't been to the website, jot it down, visit, share it. If you are not already connected on social media, if you don't follow, subscribe, here is your invitation to do so, especially with such things as YouTube, because you get an update when anything new is being posted. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the YouTube channel. Also, the QR code for Givelify and for PayPal are available so that you can use those for your tithe, your donations, your offerings. If you prefer a different method, such as check or money order, etc., remember those two email addresses? Send an email and we will let you know what is the best method and how to get it done. Also, remember those email addresses? Well, on Wednesday night, we have a Science of Mind and Spirit discussion group from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we discuss what is religious science, science of mind and spirit. How do you practice it? How do you make it a way of life? We have a very lively conversation where we discuss practical and applicable modern day uses for the teaching. Then on Thursday night, Tracy facilitates at present 7:30 to 8:30. Oh, we're in July. That means as of July 6th, the new time will be 7 to 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Where, in case this is your first time, at the end of my message, I always end with questions, things to ponder, things to discuss. And the Thursday night group gathers specifically to do that, to discuss those questions. Also, a very lively and empowering group of people discussing how to improve the quality of life individually and collectively. So, as I said, it's July, right? Yeah, that means a new theme, speaking truth to circumstances. Now, this is a reboot of the phrase speaking truth to power. Spirit is the only power there is. God is the only power there is. So there's no need to speak truth to it. You're speaking truth as it. So what people really mean when they are using this phrase is speaking to control or circumstances, pseudo-power. Circumstances are never capital T truth. So we begin by looking them in the face as the quote unquote monsters that they may seem to be. Pause. But like in the movie of the same name, they are not what they even seem to be. So we look at how we have accepted this media and cultural, sociological, theological conditioning, indoctrination. We have become hypnotized. Now we want to move through this so that we can free ourselves from this react into being in a state of authentic action and responding. Breathe. I'm not going to go over anymore because you'll get there when we get there. But today we are addressing specifically what I just spoke of, Monsters, Inc. Power is a word with many connotations, many of which tend to trigger a variety of reactions in people. So let's begin with two key things. There is only one power, and what many call power is pseudo-power. That's why there is no need to actually speak truth to power. Truth and power are one in the absolute, in the spiritual realm. What we mean when we say speaking truth to power is we are speaking truth to the collective consciousness, and the use of smoke and mirrors, distraction, deception, and the disease or dis-ease and addiction to pseudo-power. Fear-based attempts to control are masquerading as power. And when we show up as truth, expressing truth, speaking it in how we show up, all of that must crumble. Ready? Dr. Holmes says, evil is not overcome by fighting it or by recognizing it. In other words, accepting that it is an actual thing in and of itself. Like, well, we'll get to that in a second. But by non-resistance of it. Think Aikido. You yield and use its power against itself. By looking through the evil into the absolute, into the good. Thus, evil becomes transmuted. Spiritual communion dissolves evil as light dissipates the darkness. Now, this whole theme, evil, just in and of itself is triggering. Because so many things come to mind when we think of evil, and we're going to talk more about it, but breathe through each sentence as you need to. Check in with your own somatic responses. What are you feeling? What is your body telling you? And pause and breathe. Because the last thing we want to do is rush over, glaze over anything and enter into the realm of metaphysical malpractice. It's not healthy. It's not going to do any good to anybody. So let's breathe into so that evil, the energy of evil, the consciousness of evil can become transmuted in the same way that darkness automatically must fade when light shows up. So too must evil when truth shows up. Now, when we talk about evil, you said what? No, I don't understand. What is evil? Oh, evil. Something that is generally seen as being profoundly immoral and wicked. Something that is seen as nefarious or heinous, malicious, depraved, corrupt, right? These are all synonyms for evil. So let's keep in mind when we are referencing evil, we are not referencing the idea of an absolute evil. And yet, when we reference evil, we very well may be referencing how an individual who is an individualized expression of God is using their creative power for malicious intent, for nefarious purposes. Breathe. Because we have to get to the true core of the consciousness of corruption, that which is heinous, if we are going to transmute it, if we are going to transcend it, if we are going to heal it, then we have to understand it. And simply talking about there is no evil, evil doesn't exist, there's only God and God is good, that form of bypass is not going to do any good. There's no such thing as a house burning down. Oh, maybe there are. There's no such thing as, oh, maybe there are floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and cancer and rape. There are all kinds of things that occur that hurt and harm a variety of people. And while I am not saying that we use our consciousness to end tornadoes, we use our consciousness so that when someone is impacted by a tornado and they lose their house and they lose their property, we as 21st century New Thought Good Samaritans, while not bypassing by saying that's just an illusion, it doesn't exist, we step in to serve, to help, to nurture those who are in need, rather than saying, well, what was in their consciousness? Something in their consciousness clearly attracted the tornado, or it wouldn't. Just stop. Just stop. So let's breathe and move through this idea of evil so that we can transmute it. Brian D. McLaren says, that person that you call your enemy is a part of your family, part of your species, part of your story, and part of your kind. That person you call enemy, whatever that enemy may be. I hear you. And yet, part of me says, so what? The last thing most of us want to hear is that the person who hurt us or another is God, and thereby to be exonerated or forgiven or absolved of all of their abuses. So you shot up a church, you shot up a school, you killed students, you killed teachers, you killed staff, and wounded countless others. But you're God, so it's all good. No, it is not. Well, I mean, you raped me when I was young, so, but you're God, so it's all good. No, it is not. You insulted me. And yes, You are God. But clearly you don't know it, because if you really knew it and you understood what that meant, then you wouldn't insult. You wouldn't use your words to hurt, harm, traumatize, and trigger in the manner that you are with various aggressions, be they overt or covert. Because if you really understood and you were really on the path, then what would you do? You would seek to embody more God qualities. And if I'm going to embody God qualities, then I have to become present of the microaggressions that I may be engaging in that I don't even know I'm engaging in. But if I'm going to embody this more, then it means I must become more aware of this. So, yes, they are of the same species. And yes, they are God incarnating. And no, it does not mean you immediately jump into a state of saying you're forgiven. You forgive to set yourself free. First and foremost, has nothing to do with them. Forgive to set yourself free. Get the poison, the venom, the toxins out of your system. And then you hold them accountable. You stole from me. You embezzled. You raped. You, whatever it was that you did, you hold them accountable for what they have done, while also reconciling for yourself what it means that they too are an individualized expression of God. Both and. They go to jail and they're God. They pay a fine and they're God. Both and. But first and foremost, you forgive yourself so that you can move forward knowing that you too are God, that you did not attract whatever the trauma was, whatever the injury was, whatever, you did not attract it, you did not create it. The law of attraction, no, 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 no. Not going down that road, as so many who want to misuse the law of attraction, metaphysics, etc. No, we're not doing that. So, breathe and forgive yourself. Breathe and forgive yourself and hold them accountable. Because Emma Curtis Hopkins and Dr. Ruth L. Miller say we do not have to shut down the prisons and reformatories, even when we know that in truth there are no criminals in truth, capital T truth. So our only duty is to know truth about each of these individuals. Our only duty is to know, yeah, that's a typo. Our only duty is to know the truth about these individuals who are in the prisons and in the reformatories and in the mental institutions and in the rehab and in wherever they are, the shelters, the schools, the Senate, the Congress, the Supreme Court, wherever they are. Our duty is to know the truth about them and to hold them accountable wherever they are for doing whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, wherever they are. Right? So, prisons and reformatories and mental institutions are for a specific purpose. Congress and Senate, specific purpose. Supreme Court, specific purpose. Educational facilities, colleges, high schools, specific purposes. Churches, temples, synagogues, specific purpose. Hold people accountable to do what it is you are supposed to do in these places with equity and justice, while also knowing the truth about them, knowing the truth for them. Breathe. So, monster. What is a monster? Now, generally, I know we jump into the idea of, well, we give examples of monsters. Monsters are creatures, they're aliens, they're experiments gone wrong, all kinds of things. But for the sake of what we are talking about, a monster is something or someone that triggers anxiety to a really high level and or fear in us to a really high level, such that we cannot even dare to live our best lives. Something or someone that triggers such fear and anxiety. Losing a job, the thought of, the idea of losing my job, if it triggers such anxiety and fear that it causes me to freeze up, then that has become my monster. The economy plummeting, if it has caused me to lock up in fear, worry, and dread, then that has become the monster. And there, based on that, there are a lot of monsters roaming around. Now, we can think of monsters in the way that we think of, the classical, the old classical monsters. And we think about what they represent. And then even if we more modernize them and bring them into present day, what do they represent? What is the monster? Because same thing as before. The criminal in the absolute doesn't exist. The monster in the absolute doesn't exist. But in the relative, there are things that trigger us, things that frighten us, things that inspire worry in us. But what do these things represent? How often are we willing to smash open the closet door and look the monster in the face and tell it the same thing Glenda told the Wicked Witch of the Wizard in The Wizard of Oz? Get up out of here. You ain't got no power here, girl. Get back up on your broom and fly away. That's my version of it. Are you willing to face the monster? Are you willing to truly call forth your power? Now, if we're going to talk about power, then we have to be clear. What are we talking about? Because there is pseudo-power, which is what most people devour. And that's capitalistic greed. It's manipulation. It's ego-driven. It's competition where you need to get something before someone else gets it, and there's lack and scarcity because there isn't enough to go around. Pseudo-power is willing to enslave a certain race of people so that their economic power, their political power can be heightened. Pseudo-power is willing to commit genocide to take over a country in the hopes of taking over a continent, in the hopes of taking over the world. Pseudo-power. And yet, when we started, there is only one power. So that power, being God, that is the real power. That power is authentic. It is authentic understanding. It's being in alignment and using your energy of creation, using your energy of imagination to create, using your resolute conviction of your I amness to show up in the world as an individualized incarnation of God. Show up as what you are. Not what they say you are or think you are, but as you know what you are. Show up as that. That's power. Breathe. Dr. Holmes says, 1, alone in consciousness with the infinite constitutes a complete majority. There is only one. There is only one mind, and that mind is God. There is only one life, and that life is God. And that life is perfect, and that life is your life now. So the moment you are anchored deeply in that oneness, that I amness, and you know that you know, then all of creation That's why it's a majority. All of creation is with you. The law says yes, but are you ready, willing, and able to really anchor into that awareness, to proclaim and declare that you know who and what you are? To, as Plotinus says, I do not argue, I contemplate. How many of us argue? We argue with our Christian relatives. We argue with one political side versus another. We argue and we argue and we fight and we bicker. He says, I do not argue, I contemplate. And as I contemplate, I let fall the seeds of thought into the mirror of mind, which then becomes the mirror of matter. Breathe. Do we do this? Do we contemplate and let the seeds move through the process of creation to become matter, to materialize? Or is it easier to simply argue? To argue about whatever it is we're going to argue about. We argue about how the chairs in the sanctuary should be lined up. We argue about, how much the minister should get paid or not get paid. We argue about how many practitioners this, that. We argue and we argue. We argue about when the child should get their ears pierced. We argue about which bathrooms people should or shouldn't be allowed to use because of what. We argue and we argue, but rarely do we communicate and contemplate so that we can co-create. Are we being invited into that next phase, though? Or are we going to continue to simply scream and yell and argue at one another? Now, let's pause for a moment. Because argue in and of itself isn't good, bad. It's argue in and of itself is a neutral thing. Because to argue, normally when we think of it, we think of two people each trying deeply and desperately to prove that they are right. And they become loud and agitated in their, I told you, and there's an explosion. But argue also means to state something, to proclaim something. So when someone states, I am transgender, they are stating, they are arguing, they are proclaiming, they are asserting, they are advocating, right? There's all of these things. Pause. So argue in and of itself, neutral. But our invitation is, do we know when to argue and what to argue about, what to argue for? Because I'm going to stand up for the rights of my transgender siblings. I am willing to argue, to state, to proclaim, to exert, to assert, to explain, to advocate, to represent, to insist on their equity, justice, and equal human rights. I'm willing to argue that. I'm willing to argue as a member of Moms Demand Action. I'm willing to argue that any gun owner should ideally understand safe and effective storage so that what recently happened where the 2-year-old shot and killed his mother and the pregnant infant that she was carrying, killed by the 2-year-old who got a hold of an available gun, an unsecure gun. So I am going to argue for certain points. I'm going to argue for equity, justice, and human rights. I am. So arguing in and of itself isn't the thing. But I am also not going to argue the way Plotinus says. I am not going to engage in an argument where we even debate as if somehow I have to prove that transgender individuals deserve to be treated like humans. I'm not going to debate that with you. That's like me arguing, no, but I am Black. Why do you think what? Certain things are not going to be invested in that way. But we have to ask ourselves, am I willing to argue? Which means, am I willing to enter into the realm of confrontation? Because if we're going to transmute the monster, we have to confront the monster. Whether that monster is Hitler, Jeffrey Dahmer, whomever, our own lack of security, our imposter syndrome, whatever the monster is, we have to confront it. We have to know the truth so powerfully that we confront the monster with truth. Are we willing to do that? Dr. Holmes says, intuitively, we sense that every person in their native state is some part or manifestation of this eternal principle, and that the entire problem of limitation, evil, suffering, and uncertainty is the result of ignorance. Ignorance. Now, what is ignorance? Ignorance is the I don't know. That's the basic gist of. If someone is ignorant of, then they don't know. Oh, but there are some folks who don't want to know. But either way, it is this consciousness of not knowing, not embodying, not being willing to change, not willing to evolve, being stuck in 1958, the consciousness of 1812, even though it's 2023. So if we want to shift limitation, evil, suffering, and uncertainty, if ignorance is what's causing it, then truth is what heals it and changes it. So ignorance is what causes school shootings and mass shootings. Ignorance is what causes the vast number of continually growing number of indigenous women who are missing and murdered. Ignorance is what lynched Emmett Till. Ignorance upon ignorance upon ignorance. Ignorance of a greedy capitalistic system is what creates, except for those who choose to be unhoused. But there are many who would rather be housed, but because of the system of ignorance, they cannot. Ignorance, as it shows up in, through, and as the blue wall that does what happened to Emmett Till and the missing and murdered and indigenous women, the school shootings. There are people who wear the uniform and the badge who we know, statistics are already showing, they're white supremacists and they're neo-Nazis and others. And yet, under the banner of to protect and serve who? Ignorance. So just like an X-ray or just like an MRI looks beyond or beneath the surface, we are called metaphysically to look beyond the conditions, to look beyond the effect, to look beyond the surface, to identify the consciousness that has and is still creating pain, suffering, trauma, violence, murder, and more. Because we cannot change what we will not address, what we will not confront. We can't. Ignorance. Ignorance is what creates a group of people called the Klan under the banner of Christianity. Ignorance is what creates Hitler and the Nazis and the Third Reich. Ignorance is Moms for Liberty, who quoted Hitler. Ignorance, Westboro Baptist Church, that is indoctrinating their children to say, God hates America. God blew up the shuttle. God hates enablers. Ignorance. Ignorance that shows up as white nationalism, Christian nationalism, neo-Nazism, etc. in modern day 2023. Ignorance. And so, once again, just like the x-rays, just like the MRI, there's the CAT scan, which allows the physician to see what they are looking at, but allows them to see it differently. Metaphysicians, see, physicians look at the CT scan. Metaphysicians are also invited to do the same thing. How am I being called to look at these conditions, this consciousness, this effect? How am I being called to look at it differently? What is the consciousness that creates the dis-ease of war, of racism, of hatred, of evil? What is the consciousness, the belief systems and the paradigms that create this? Because once again, we cannot change what we are unwilling to look at. If I am unwilling to look at it, to address it, then it doesn't change. It actually will continue to spiral and get worse. Breathe. Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, contemplative, meditative, committed citizens, never doubt that they cannot change the world, because indeed, they are the only ones who ever have. If we look back through history, it was a tiny handful, if you go back, tiny handful of individuals who sparked the Stonewall riots that eventually became Pride. It's a tiny handful of people who actually sparked and started what became the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement. Small groups of individuals. Are we willing to be within such a group? Are we already such a group? Are we thoughtful, contemplative, meditative, prayerful, and committed? If we are, then it should show up in our actions. If we're not, are we willing to change that? Matt Planck says, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. We've all heard some version of this before. We've said some version of this before. Yes, 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 and yes. And as soon as I read that quote, what immediately comes to my mind is one of my all-time favorite actors, Robin Williams, and one of my all-time favorite films, The Dead Poets Society. And in the film, Mr. Keating, Robin Williams, stands on the desk. And then you go through the film and, ultimately you get to the end and you find that he has inspired several other students to rise up and others not. They were too afraid. Too afraid of what? Too afraid to change, too afraid to stand up, too afraid to confront, too afraid to live the truth. For a variety of reasons, but afraid. And Mr. Keating says, I stand upon my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way, that we must constantly be open at the top and open at the bottom, that we must constantly be what it means to be ever-evolving consciousness. So I stand here as a reminder. Where do you stand? What is your reminder? So that you can see things differently, so that you are reminded to be ever-evolving consciousness. Reverend Ray says, like the exorcist who casts out the demon by acquiring its name and thus gaining access to its nature, thereby having control over it, we are called to cast out racism, sexism, homomesia, white supremacy, poverty, gun violence, sex trafficking, and more. We are called to cast those out. And we do so by naming the nature, the consciousness of these quote unquote demons. We must stop playing by the rules that created these experiences and these conditions. For as long as we abide by those rules, for as long as we show up based upon those rules, doesn't change. So we have to change. The priest in the story of the exorcism and what the exorcism does or what the exorcist does, they don't play by the rules of the demon who is possessing the individual. They are anchored in truth and they call forth that which is unclean, corrupt, and they cast it out. We are invited to be anchored in the truth in the same way and call forth the experience, the conditions that we desire to experience. Treat and move our feet. But we must be willing to confront. Today's declaration or affirmation, I will say it first, and if it feels that you are aligned with it, then say it with me on the second go round. I align with my true power and let her rip. Together. I align with my true power and I let her rip. Breathe. And so it is. This week's questions for the discussion for Thursday night or for your own spiritual journaling and practicing and contemplation. Number one, who or what is a monster that you were or currently are afraid of or bothered by or triggered by? What new point of view might be effective in reducing or eliminating the monster's hold on you or their hold of you? Number two, where or when have you gotten caught up in believing in the small r reality of a circumstance? Do you know what a small r reality of a circumstance is? So let's say, for an example, when I lived in Richmond and ended up homeless. Small r reality is, yes, I lost my apartment or my living arrangements with who I thought was my fiance or going to be my whatever. It's a completely different conversation. The person that I was living with. And I ended up homeless for a brief stint of time. Now, being caught up in that is, I'm unhoused. Oh my goodness, I'm never gonna have an apartment again. I'm gonna live on the streets. What am I gonna do? Where am I gonna find my food? That's getting caught up in the small r versus saying, I currently have nowhere to live. Let me start looking for places. Hey, hello. You know any apartment buildings in it? Okay, right? Rather than being caught up in it. How can you remember to return back to first cause, source, in the face of whatever the monsters are? How can you remember to go back to first cause, to source in such instances? Number three, what is a time or circumstance where you aligned in consciousness with spirit and created as a result that had seemed impossible or at least improbable? So there's a time in your life where you created something, you're like, oh snap, how did that happen? What described that? What is a time or circumstance where you were aligned? All things were firing, your chakras, your aura, your consciousness, whatever it is, your emotions, your mental equivalent, all of it was like boop, 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 boo, doo. Oh, it was ready. And boom, you created something that you were like, ah, that's a miracle. You didn't expect it. That's a miracle. You thought it was impossible. That's a miracle. It's not a miracle. It's what happens when you align consciousness, when all of these things come together. It's spiritual practice. So what was such a time as this? And then lastly, what can or what will you do today to create a world that works for all? Simple as that. To less monsters, more beloved community. What can you or what will you do this week to create a world that works for all? Breathe. Anchoring deeply to this breath, we simply acknowledge that which God is, we are. And knowing that it is all there is, it is right where we are. And so as I close out in prayer, I close out knowing that wherever we are, God is. Whatever we're doing, God is doing. Whatever we are thinking, God is thinking. Whatever we are feeling, God is feeling. Because God is what we are. It is incarnating in, through, and as us. It is us. The mind that we use is the mind that is God. The life that is living us is the one life. There is no separating. Now, we can mental gymnastics and separate, but that doesn't change the truth. So, in this moment, we anchor and ground in this truth, the truth of love, the truth of power, the truth of presence, the truth of speaking truth to circumstances and experiences, the truth of manifestation, of creation, the truth of the divine, which is our truth. And the law says yes. And because it says yes, I simply stand back and marvel at the magnificent and powerful way that the universe shows up and shows out and lets it rip with joy and wonder and laughter and love and community. And I breathe with gratitude. And so it is. Namaste, blessings, and see you over in Zoom.